Hello, I would like to welcome you to this on-demand session of the Salt Lake County Watershed Symposium, which is gone virtual for 2020. Thank you for being here today. This talk is titled Climate Solutions from Local to Global. And I am Maura Honnenberger. I am part of the Geosciences Department at Salt Lake Community College. And I would like to start today's presentation with a land acknowledgement. The Salt Lake Valley, where Salt Lake Community College is located, has always been a gathering place for Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that this land is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes and is a crossroads for Indigenous peoples. And a little bit about me again. I am Maura Honnenberger. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am an associate professor in the Geosciences Department at Salt Lake Community College. You can find on the slide here my contact information, maura.honnenberger@slcc.edu. You can also find me on Twitter at Dr.Maura_science. And so after this presentation, feel free to get in touch with me. I would love to talk more about this topic with you or present at additional venues. So today in this talk, we're going to be using a tool called Enroads. And Enroads is developed by Climate Interactive along with the MIT part of their sustainability initiative. So we're going to start with a little introduction. And so in this introduction, I'll talk just a little bit about Enroads, although it helps, I think, to just kind of jump into Enroads' introduction to the current state of our climate system and why Enroads is an important tool in looking at climate solutions from local to global. So what is Enroads? Enroads is a cutting-edge simulation model used to test climate solutions and generate climate scenarios for the future. And so in a little bit, we will be using this tool and trying out different climate solutions and trying to reach different targets. But basically, what you need to know right now is that Enroads is based on the best science. It is dynamic. It updates in real time. And it is transparent, it's well documented, and it's customizable. So all of the different levers and things on Enroads, you can go in and really customize them to really specific solutions that you are interested in. And so you can go into Enroads and create climate solutions that are as simple or as detailed as you would like. So you can just go with the defaults that Enroads has set up in their dashboard board, or you can customize as well. And so we'll look at some examples of that in a couple minutes. And so I wanted to start again with this quote from Buckminster Fuller. If you want to teach people a new way of thinking, don't bother trying to teach them. Instead, give them a tool, the use of which will lead to new ways of thinking. And our hope is that Enroads can be one of these tools. So Enroads has been used by over 30,000 participants in 65 countries. I use Enroads at Salt Lake Community College in my climate change classes with my students, but you can see that Enroads is used all over the world. And I am on the pathway right now to become a Enroads ambassador. After this presentation, if you want to know more about that, just get in touch with me. Or if you want me to do a similar presentation or actually interactive workshop with your organization, that's another great option. So we'll start out doing just a brief review of the science and what is at stake here in the fight against human-caused climate change. So here is a graph of carbon dioxide levels. And so this data here, most of this data in this graph is from ice cores, but the most recent data is from our instrumental record. And so this is going back, going from on the right side here is our current levels. So this is present on the right, and then we're going back 800,000 years into the past, again, using those ice cores. And that's our x-axis. And then the y-axis here is our carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million. And so what we see from this graph is that carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere are not static, they change over time. And so in this 800,000 year paleoclimate record, we can see that we have times when carbon dioxide was higher and carbon dioxide was varies kind of up and down. And what we find is that those values are correlated with the temperatures at those times as well. And so what we call these times when the carbon dioxide was low are glacial periods. And then when the carbon dioxide levels were higher, we call that an interglacial period. And our most recent glacial period is called the Pleistocene. And that was kind of the most recent period in Utah where we had many glaciers. We had Lake Bonneville, and we had big glaciers coming down to the base of Little Cottonwood Canyon. In more recent time, in the period called the Holocene, that has been a interglacial period. And in that, we had what we call pre-industrial levels of CO2, which was right around 280 parts per million. And so 280 parts per million is the value we consider pre-industrial CO2 levels. And then you can see a line here that for the past 800,000 years, this dashed line, the CO2 values have not been above that. Due to human emissions of greenhouse gases, and in this case specifically carbon dioxide, what we have seen is that we have blown past this line. We are really in territory we have not seen in over a million years on our planet. And so we now, in present levels, have CO2 concentrations over 400 parts per million. And those continue to rise with our continued emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And so if we look at a little bit more recent times, this graph is looking at two different historical temperature data sets from 1850 towards present. And what we see is that we do see an increasing trend in warming of temperatures. And that trend in increasing temperatures accelerated in the 1970s. And so sometimes this is called global warming, but often we talk about this as climate change because warming temperatures of the globe is not the only issue we're dealing with here. So there's a lot of repercussions with this global warming that we are seeing, that we're seeing climate changes throughout the world. And so what is causing the increases in CO2 and that in those warming temperatures? It's really the main source is burning of fossil fuels. And so that's what this graph is showing. On the x-axis is our year and the y-axis is CO2 emissions. And so we can see we have increasing CO2 emissions total. And what are the main sources of that? In recent decades, what we've seen is the main things are coal, oil, and gas are the biggest contributors to that. There are some additional ones. Land use changes is another one big source of that is deforestation, and then other sources as well. But the biggest contribution is from the burning of fossil fuels. And so what is going to happen? So if we continue on kind of what we call business as usual, we will see further warming of temperatures. And there is uncertainty in exactly how much of those temperatures. And so here's a screenshot from Enroads. And in the Enroads, in the business as usual system, we're seeing a increase in temperature by 2100 of 4.1 degrees Celsius or 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit. On this graph as well, we see two other little dashed lines, and those are some different climate goals that have been set in different international and national discussions. And so the two goals that are most commonly cited are 2 degrees Celsius of warming or 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And so you may have heard of the Paris Climate Agreement or the Paris Accord, and in that agreement, we were looking at that 2 degrees Celsius goal. And so we'll come back to that in a couple minutes. So if we just go for business as usual and have that 4 degrees Celsius or 7.2 degree Fahrenheit of warming, what are some of the potential impacts of that? And so this is just a brief selection. There's many, many more we could look at, but here are a couple examples. And so we would have a really big sea level rise of around 1.2 meters or about 4 feet, which would inundate many, many coastal areas and coastal cities around the world. We would have melting of more than 2/3 of the glaciers in the Himalayas, and the Himalayan glaciers, they provide water for a little over 2 billion people. About 1 in 6 species would go extinct, and about 3/4 of the world population would be exposed to lethal heat for more than 20 days per year, which would likely lead to increased deaths due to those heat waves. So now we're going to go on to, okay, well, that's the situation we're in. And so if we want to create solutions to this, how can we do that? How can we reduce that warming so we don't get to that 4.1 degrees Celsius in 2100? And so that's where we're going to go into using this En-ROADS tool to think about what your organization can do and how you can think about creating climate solutions from local in your own neighborhood, your own organization, to global. And so this is kind of the structure of En-ROADS. And so we have the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that impacts the temperature, which is what the output of En-ROADS is. And then also in En-ROADS, there are impacts. Today, we only have a limited amount of time, so we probably won't be going into the impacts very much, but you can play with this tool on your own. And so what goes into this total greenhouse gases? We have energy, CO2 emissions, so that could be things like coal-fired power plants. We have land use emissions, so what land is being used for, whether it's forests or agriculture. We have removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, which could be things like afforestation or planting trees and forests, or other types of technology that remove carbon dioxide. And then we also have the impacts of other greenhouse gases. So while CO2 is the biggest impact on our changing temperatures, other greenhouse gases do have a impact as well. And so a lot of things impact all of these things. And so other things that are included in this model are population, our consumption, the energy intensity that we're using, and carbon intensity of the energy. So carbon intensity, is comparing the energy sources like, say, coal versus wind power, where that renewable energy source of wind power uses much less carbon and releases much less CO2 for each unit of energy it's created. So this is the En-ROADS control panel, and it's a little bit overwhelming at first. And so this presentation is just kind of a brief introduction to En-ROADS and this control panel. And so I will invite you, I have the links in the presentation to look at this in detail. And you can also find lots of training on En-ROADS at climateinteractive.org. There's some basic training and just videos. And there is also more intensive training if you really want to get to know and use En-ROADS in more detail. And so we have this broken down in a control panel into different categories. So on the left side of the control panel, we have energy supply. And so energy supply, where are we getting our energy and what are potential controls of that? And so we have different energy sources: coal, oil, renewables, nuclear, natural gas, bioenergy. And then we also have things that could impact our energy supply, such as new technology or implementing a carbon price. Next, we have transportation. And so we have two main sliders for transportation: the efficiency, energy efficiency of our transportation, and then electrification of our transportation. And so that's electrification has been getting more attention recently with private companies that are putting out electric vehicles. And so that's another slider you can play with. Next, we have buildings and industry. And again, we have efficiency and electrification there. And then on this middle panel, we also have growth, population and economic growth. So you can slide those around as well. And then in the last column, we have land and industry emissions. So we have sliders for deforestation and then methane and other emissions. And then lastly, carbon removal. And so the two categories for carbon removal are afforestation and then technological impacts. So now we're going to go to, okay, what type of actions can we take? And so I want you to start thinking to yourself about your actions at the local level. So what actions have you or your organization done in the last 5 years to help mitigate climate change? And so these could be small things, or they could be a little bit bigger things. So what are some examples? So maybe your organization has started to transition their fleet from gasoline-powered vehicles to hybrid or electric vehicles. Maybe in your own life, you've put solar panels on your house. That's something I have done in the past 5 years. So putting solar panels, or maybe your organization put solar panels on their buildings. Maybe you've worked on efficiency of use and updated windows in a home or things like that. So what are actions that you or your organization have already done in the last 5 years to help mitigate climate change? And I invite you after this presentation to play with this simulator yourself, and you can put those in there and see what their climate impact is. But then, of course, we need to move beyond just local effect or local changes. And so we need to bring this to global. And so what else would it take to limit warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius, or even to just 1.5 degrees Celsius? We sort of are locked in that we are going to have some amount of warming, but how can we limit to maybe one of those two goals? So that's where we're going to go next, is to look at the simulator and see how can we potentially get to 2 degrees Celsius. And so we'll play around with it and see what we can do. So I'm going to switch over now to the live simulator. And so to find this, you can go to climateinteractive.org, and they have a link on that page. Or you can go to en-roads.climateinteractive.org, and you can also find this. Or you can just Google En-ROADS, EN-ROADS, and you will find it that way as well. And so when you first come to the simulator, it is set up as the business as usual scenario. And on the top, there'll be some graphs, and these are kind of the default graphs, but you can customize these. Probably today we won't do too much customization. We might try looking at one or two other graphs, but you can customize the graphs and look at lots of different impacts and other different types of data, whatever you're interested in. And then on the upper right-hand corner, you have kind of the dashboard that gives your temperature increase. And so again, in that business as usual, we're at that 4.1 degrees Celsius or 7.3 degrees Fahrenheit. There is also an option if you more of a Fahrenheit person, is you can swap these and have it Fahrenheit. And if you're doing this with a group, that might be helpful, because I know people in the US are more comfortable with Fahrenheit. Okay, so then we have, oh yeah, and so anyways, so the graph on the right is that temperature rise, and then the graphs on the left are the global sources of primary energy and how those change over time. And so in here, we have the red line, which is oil. And even in the business as usual scenario, we actually see that we do reach what we call peak oil around 2060 or so, maybe a little after. In the latter part of the century, oil use starts to decline, and that's mainly due to reduced supply, which increases the price of oil. Coal is in the brown, and there is no peak coal in this scenario. We can see coal keeps on rising. There are quite a bit of coal reserves, and so there's less of kind of that downward push on coal. And then the blue line third is gas. And so in the business as usual scenario, those three fossil fuels remain as the dominant energy sources through the end of the century, even while some of these other sources do rise as well. And then we have renewables, which does increase, but does not overtake the fossil fuel sources. We have bioenergy, nuclear energy, and then new technology. And so those are the energy sources. And so what we like to do is to think about, when you change something, how do you think that's going to impact what's going on up here? And so let's start with one example. And so going back to the question I asked, well, what are things that you have done? I gave some ideas of maybe you're changing your fleet to more hybrid or electric vehicles. And so that would go into the electrification. And so how does this slider work? We have the status quo, and then we can slide to, in this case, to the right, which would be more incentives for electrification of our transportation, or we can go to the left, which would be more kind of disincentives. And so when we do this, it's sort of fun to think about, okay, well, what do you think the impact would be? Which of these things might change the most? And so with electrification, that might have maybe the biggest influence on oil, because oil or gasoline is produced from oil. And so let's see what happens. And I'll just, for fun, we'll slide this all the way over to the right. So we're going to go all the way over to where transport is highly incentivized to be electrified. And so let me go back so you can see that again. So let's go back to business as usual. And so when we do that, so if you look at the global primary sources of energy, you see that oil went down. So we have less use of oil. But coal actually went up because we're now using more electricity. And so coal is helping to take up some of that slack from not using oil anymore. But renewables also went up as well. And so we're getting more of that electricity for our transport from coal and renewables. And so what we see is that the temperature change hasn't changed very much. It only changed 0.1 because we are we're still burning those fossil fuels of particularly coal here. Okay, so what else can we do? And so another one I mentioned was putting solar panels on your house. And so that would bring us over to energy supply and our renewables. And so maybe we can increase our use of renewables. And so I'm going to slide this over to increase our renewables. And we can see that when we do that, I'll slide it back and forth, and you can play around with this yourself, that when we highly subsidize renewables, we see this rapid rise in use of renewable energy. And so with highly subsidized renewable energy, we get to where renewables are really, by 2100, the dominant source here. But coal still a big factor. And so we've reduced to 3.8, even with as high renewables, but we still have coal being a big source, and gas as well. Okay, so what else can we do? So I also mentioned maybe replacing the windows on your building or your house. And so that brings us down to buildings and industry. And that would be in our energy efficiency of buildings and energy industry. And so let's just go ahead and slide this one all the way over as well. And so with this, what we see is that it actually reduces all of those energy sources. So we don't need as much renewable energy, and we also don't need as much coal, oil, or gas, or other energy sources as well. And so by being more efficient with the energy, we can use less of that energy. And so now we're doing better. We're getting closer. We're down to 3.3 degrees Celsius. Okay, so where do we want to go next? So I'm trying to think about other organizations that might be here in this presentation, and one that I thought of is Tree Utah. And so one thing that they do is help people to plant trees. There's other organizations that do that as well, and we call that afforestation. And just planting a couple trees here and there obviously doesn't have a huge climate impact. But if we do this on a larger scale and really trying to afforest many areas and also prevent deforestation, then that can have a pretty big impact on our climate. And so let's go to afforestation and deforestation. And so let's start with afforestation. So we're going to say we're going to go out and in a large scale plant more trees, increase that biomass to absorb carbon dioxide. And when we do that, we afforest. What we see is that it doesn't impact our energy sources, because really planting more trees doesn't have a big impact on the sources of energy. But it did help remove some of that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but only down to about 3.2. So why? Because at the same time as we are afforesting, we were still deforesting. And so if we want afforesting to have a bigger impact, we really need to stop deforesting, or else it's just kind of cancels each other out somewhat. And so let's drop our deforestation and highly reduce our deforestation. And we find that that also does have a climate impact. And so now we're down to 3.1. Okay, so where do we want to go next? Let's go over back to our energy supply and think about if there are ways that we can further reduce our use of fossil fuels. And one that has been put out there quite a bit, that again, it's not something you're going to do on an individual level, but this is moving to the more global, national or global level. This is also done at a state or province level in some places, which is implementing a carbon price. And there's different ways that this can be implemented as a cap and trade or a carbon tax. But in some way implementing a price on carbon with the idea that that will help de-incentivize carbon-rich energy sources. And so we'll just go way full bore with this carbon price, and we'll do a very, very high carbon price. And when we put in a very high carbon price, what we see is that just really reduces the rest of those fossil fuels. So oil has gone way down, coal has gone way down, gas has gone way down. And so we've reduced those sources, and now renewable energy is really, really the dominant source. By about 2060 or so, renewable energy is really what is producing or getting us there. Okay, so we're down to 2.3, so we're getting close. We only need a 0.3 more degrees to get to our goal of 2 degrees Celsius. And so let's go to energy efficiency of transportation. So we haven't done that one yet. So in transportation, we already electrified our transportation, but we can also make it more efficient. And so let's see what happens is if we increase the efficiency of our transportation. Okay, so that reduced our need for renewable energy sources. So we reduced that. It reduced our fossil fuel sources a little bit, but they were already really low because of that carbon price. So it didn't help us too much. It got us down to about 2.2. So okay, we already reduced these a lot. So what are some other options? So maybe we can now move to other ways to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with carbon removal technologies. And so that comes us over back to the bottom right side, and let's increase our carbon removal technologies. I'll just increase it right to where we can get to 2.0. And so with medium growth of carbon removal technologies, we can meet that 2.0 goal. And you can play around with this more to see how you can get this. But one thing to note, which I was bringing up with when I moved to energy efficiency of transport, is that these are interactive with each other. These factors are interactive. And so at one point, if you change energy efficiency of transport, depending on other things you've clicked on and changed, sometimes that might change your temperature quite a bit, and other times it might not change it very much, depending on what the other little levers are that you have checked on. So now we see the business as usual line in the black, and then the what we've created, our scenario, in the blue line. And another cool tool here is that you can share this scenario. And so in the upper right-hand corner, you can click on share your scenario, and you can share it on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, by email, or you can just copy the scenario link and save it or share it with someone. So if you want to save that scenario you just created, you can. And let me just show you one more little cool tool they have here. I'm going to go to our view. And if you go to view, there's an option to do the Kaiographs. And so I'm going to click on Kaiographs. And this just gives a little bit more information about what has changed. And so in this one, we didn't touch population growth. And so population growth has not changed as from business as usual. It's still increasing. We did not look at economic growth, and so GDP per capita has also not changed from business as usual. But the energy intensity of our GDP has decreased dramatically. And so due to the efficiency measures that we did, our energy efficiency of transport, energy efficiency of buildings and industry, that the energy intensity of that GDP we have is reduced a lot. And then also the carbon intensity of our energy is also dramatically dropped because we put that big carbon price on our energy. And so that helped us change to more renewable sources of energy. And then the last graph here is our emissions of carbon dioxide. And so in the presentation, we saw that big rise in the emissions of carbon dioxide. And so which the business as usual as it continues to rise, but by putting on that high carbon price, that helped us to reduce those CO2 emissions, not to zero, but to pretty low levels by 2100. So that is it's climate simulator. And so let's go hop back to just a couple more slides in this presentation. And so then we like to do a little debrief. And so we won't spend much time on this. When we're doing it in a workshop format, we would think about this for a couple minutes and have a discussion. But think about something you would love about being part of that sort of future where we have met those climate goals. And so what surprised you when we implemented these solutions in En-ROADS? Or did you have any key insights? And what will you take away from today? And how can you apply what you learned to the real world? And so I won't do this right now, but what we like to do when we do this in a workshop format is to take 1 minute of silence to really reflect on your experience and then have a discussion about that. So I'll invite you to do that on your own. You can press pause if you want and take a minute to reflect. And so I have a couple quotes here. Albert Einstein said, "The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking." And that's really the goal of En-ROADS, is to help us think about, well, how can we reach these goals? Sometimes it seems really overwhelming. So what can we actually do? What are concrete things that can happen to help us meet that goal of 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius? And then another quote from Margaret Mead saying, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And so since you chose to listen to this presentation, I hope that you are one of those thoughtful, committed citizens who really want to change the world. And so En-ROADS is just one tool. It's just a tool to help us do that, to help educate people on what climate solutions are possible and get people excited about moving toward those climate solutions. And so I want you to also reflect on what you can do. And so this little graphic here is just thinking about what are your kind of spheres of influence? What are the things that are around you in your life? And so you have your own self, you have your, family, your social networks, your organizations, and where can you be an influence in now and in the future? So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation, and I definitely invite you to explore more. So head to climateinteractive.org and you can check out the En-ROADS simulator on your own and play around with it. And then if you want to get more in depth with En-ROADS, they have a variety of different types of training. And if you're interested in getting in touch with me, again, here's my contact information. And I am happy to talk with you more about climate science or about En-ROADS. And I also am available to do similar presentations or workshops, or they even have a game for En-ROADS where we can kind of simulate being in an international climate conference and how we can have different stakeholders thinking about En-ROADS and climate solutions. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate you listening. And please, I encourage you to check out the climate simulator on your own and get in touch with me.